Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a forensic scientific investigation into Earth's history. We're going to look at the rocks, the fossils, the atmosphere, and we're asking one very specific, kind of fascinating question. If uniformitarianism, the idea that the present is the key to the past, if that was the absolute right framework for science, how would Earth look today? Because when we really zoom in on the evidence, we have to ask a hard question. Does the math, and specifically the physics, actually add up? So let's just drop right into a massive physical puzzle. Could a 250-kilogram reptile fly today? I want you to meet the Quetzalcoatlus. It's this absolutely massive prehistoric pterosaur with an 11-meter wingspan. We have its skeleton, right? We know for a fact it existed, and its skeletal architecture is quite literally built for flight. But here's the catch. When aerodynamicists run the lift equations using today's atmospheric density, it crashes. The math just doesn't work. So we have to ask ourselves, has the math of nature always been exactly the same as it is today?
Section 1. The uniformitarian assumption. Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand this puzzle, we first have to look at the baseline framework that mainstream science uses to read the Earth's past, and that is uniformitarianism. Basically, it's the assumption that Earth's features are the products of processes operating at the exact same rates we can observe today, acting over immense spans of deep time. Crucially, this means assuming things like atmospheric density, surface gravity, and the gradual deposition of rock layers have remained relatively constant for millions and millions of years. Now, it's a very productive model, absolutely, but we need to see what happens when we apply that exact baseline to the physical evidence buried in the fossil record.
Section 2. The impossible giants.
And that brings us to our first real forensic anomaly. Let's look at the biomechanics of prehistoric mega-animals and see what happens when we force today's physics onto yesterday's bones. 100 metric tons. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the estimated mass of immense sauropods like Patagotitan and Argentinosaurus. These were biological marvels, literally towering over the landscape. But mechanically speaking, they present an absolute engineering nightmare. Just imagine being a living, breathing animal and having to pump thick blood 10 meters straight up into the air, fighting gravity the entire way just to keep your brain conscious.
The math of cardiovascular failure is fascinating here. Under our current physical laws, at exactly 1 atmosphere of pressure and 9.8 meters per second squared of gravity, vertical blood flow for a massive sauropod would require blood pressure so intensely high that it would physically rupture known biological vessel walls. The biological engine simply fails under modern conditions. Because of this, the standard uniformitarian model often proposes a behavioral solution. They suggest that, maybe these giants didn't hold their heads high at all, but rather kept their long necks strictly horizontal their entire lives just to survive.
And we see a very similar problem up in the sky. A 250-kilogram Quetzalcoatlus trying to generate the lift required to fly under our current atmospheric density completely exceeds the known limits of any biological muscle system. Because the lift equations just flat out don't work under today's sky, uniformitarian models sometimes reclassify this massive flying reptile as just a grounded stalker that walked around and never flew. But what if the skeleton is right, and it's the atmosphere that was different?
This is exactly where our sources introduce a catastrophic framework known as the Unified Theory of Geologic History, or UTGH. The theory argues that if you tweak the physics to these highly specific pre-flood parameters, raising atmospheric pressure up to around 2 atmospheres, slightly lowering surface gravity, and increasing the oxygen fraction, suddenly, the math perfectly aligns. Under those conditions, towering giants can safely pump blood to their brains, and a 250-kilogram reptile can effortlessly take to the sky. By changing the environment, the biological impossibilities just mathematically vanish.
Section 3. The Ice Age Paradox. Now let's pivot away from biology and get into thermodynamics. Most of us just accept the Ice Age as a given historical fact, right? But physically speaking, it is a massive thermodynamic problem. In fact, if the standard slow model was the right framework, you could argue there never would have been an ice age at all. Think of the climate as a giant engine. An ice age requires enormous heat to evaporate the oceans, and simultaneously, it requires darkened, cool skies to freeze all that evaporated moisture as deep snow on the continents. Basically, you need an incredible amount of thermal fuel to move that much oceanic moisture onto the land. So where does all that thermal fuel come from? Under the standard model, the explanation relies on Milankovitch cycles. These are very slow orbital wobbles that slightly reduce sunlight over tens of thousands of years. But here's the issue. Reducing sunlight is a cooling mechanism. It really struggles to explain the massive thermal heat source you need to evaporate the oceans in the first place. On the flip side,
The UTGH model proposes what they call a rupture event, a catastrophic, highly pressurized subterranean water release that rapidly boils the oceans and injects massive amounts of debris into the atmosphere, darkening the sky. Looking at the mechanics of it, the UTGH actually provides a very specific mechanism for this ice age engine. It proposes massive, rapid evaporation from a ruptured heated ocean, which then falls as deep snow onto continents that are being heavily cooled by a dust-filled atmosphere. The engine simply runs on overdrive until the oceans eventually cool back down to normal. It mathematically tries to answer the crucial question that the slow model struggles with. Where did the thermal energy and the moisture actually come from? Let's just look at the sheer scale of the catastrophist math for a moment. The rupture event energy budget outlines the sudden release of subcrustal water from 96.6 kilometers deep. We are talking about water that was under 40,000 atmospheres of pressure, reaching temperatures over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The total heat release calculated by this model, 9.84 times 10 to the 25th joules. To put that completely wild number into perspective, that is the thermodynamic equivalent of 246 dinosaur-killing asteroid impacts. That is the staggering amount of energy they argue is required to fuel a single rapid ice age engine.
Section 4. A different Earth entirely. Now, if an event of this absolute magnitude actually occurred, we are looking at a different Earth entirely. We're talking about how a catastrophe physically changes the literal shape of a world through angular momentum. It's exactly like a figure skater spinning on the ice. When they pull their arms in, they spin faster. A loss of mass and a shrinking radius alters planetary rotation. The UTGH calculation states that as these massive subterranean chambers collapsed, Earth's radius shrank by about 46 kilometers. This changed the planetary momentum of inertia, spinning the Earth faster and ultimately altering the length of a year from ancient 360-day calendars to our current 365.25 days. In this model, the math of the solar system literally holds the scar of the event.
So let's summarize the forensic physical impossibilities we've been investigating today. 1. We see knife-edge sedimentary layers worldwide that totally lack the gradual weathering you'd expect to see if they were exposed for millions of years. 2. The biomechanics of giant animals completely fail under current gravity and air density equations. And 3. The formation of an ice age lacks a thermodynamic heat source in the slow uniformitarian model. The UTGH framework attempts to unite all of these isolated physical anomalies into one single massive catastrophic boundary condition. Which brings us to our final thought. If the physical evidence, the cardiovascular limits of towering dinosaurs, the lift equations of giant pterosaurs, the missing heat required for the ice age, if all of that mathematically requires a completely different physical past, are we reading the Earth's memory correctly? I really hope this explainer has given you a fascinating new structured lens to look at the rocks and fossils around us. It's an incredible physics puzzle, and it's out there waiting to be solved.